Hello, my name is Jason Leahy, Executive Director of the Illinois Principals Association. Thanks for joining me for this IPA talk. Grateful to have with me Gary Tipsword, former superintendent, now retired, and now the Executive Director of the Illinois Association of Regional Superintendents of Schools. Of course, I shouldn't make that sound, Gary, like this is a brand new thing for you because you've been in this new role now for a little bit. In fact, this is our second opportunity to chat in this venue, particularly about the educator shortage report and the survey, all that work, the good work that the regional soups do in collaboration with the state board and some others. So grateful for the opportunity to chat with you a little bit about what this year's survey has to say.
Yeah, it's good to be here again, Jason. Appreciate you. Appreciate you reaching out.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, it's obviously something that's important. It's definitely still on our minds as we talk about our supply of educators and things that are out there. Obviously, when I'm out and about, I know you do the same. When we're out talking with school leaders, especially at this time of the year. And it's March 31st when we're doing this recording,
Right.
but we're heading into April. So if hiring hasn't started for some schools, it probably will be. And of course, they're looking at their candidate pools and a whole variety of things. So I guess, Gary, kind of first thing out of the gate here, looking at the survey of superintendents across the state and their feelings about the educator shortage, just, what are the results telling us this year?
Yeah. So I think we tried to be a little bit intentional this year about asking some questions that revolved around how are you actually attacking the problem and where have you seen success? And so in some ways, we got a lot of the same types of responses that we've had for years, which is, hey, even where we don't have positions unfilled, it still feels like a problem, right? You have nearly 90% of the districts that are saying it feels like a problem. It's something that we're concerned about. You had over 90% that said the applicant pool is so small, they worry about the competitiveness. But in the areas where we talked about how are you actually seeing gains in solving problems, um, we're relying heavily on our retired teachers. We're relying heavily on paraprofessionals that are seeking to move up into the teaching field. But every time a paraprofessional moves up into the teaching field, that's now also a paraprofessional
Yeah,
position that's left
that's
open.
right.
So we're relying on the people who have a willingness to plug in who we already know. But the front end supply side still seems to be something that maybe we're not talking about enough of understanding what's going on there and how do we attract more people to that side of it.
So let me ask you this, Gary, and I know, the data says what it does, and we get the results that we do, and we review those. But, if we've got 90% of school leaders that are still feeling like it's a shortage, the shortage is still a significant problem, even if they're in a district where they're doing okay hiring people, maybe the candidate pool is still not too bad for them, depending on the part of the state that they're in, whatever, but they're
Yeah.
still feeling like it's a significant pressure point. Like, why do you think that is? Is it just because we do have people discussing it, or they know it's been a problem in the past, and so they've not seen enough to solve it, or what? I mean, like, what do you think the feeling, if anything, besides it being a real issue for some, obviously, is still perpetuating
Right.
the way it is?
Yeah, I think if you look back 10 years, 15 years, the number of applicants that we would have, right? And so you always felt like you had a really good pool, you were going to find a really good. So what I think is driving the feeling is the reality, even where it's not a problem, they're not getting the same applicant pool that they once did.
Yeah.
And so if that applicant pool is small, right, they know that then that's a limited resource. And you still have over 800 districts in the state of Illinois that are competing for that limited resource. And so I think that's what's driving that sense. I also think you have um, you have kind of a media context about the performance of our students and are our public schools is performing as well as they can. And so you're dealing with that kind of media sensation, that media feeling where maybe the profession itself doesn't feel maybe as rewarding as what, in the reality when we walk into our own schools, we
Mhm.
feel pretty good about what we're doing for kids. But when we walk out of that space, everything we hear seems to be more negative than positive.
Yeah. Which typically is because of some political rationale for needing to say it the way that it's
Right.
being described in the way that it's being described or whatever. It doesn't make that easy though when you have social media and other things that tend to amplify that. That's for sure. So, with regards to the results, Gary, we're still seeing that depending on the parts of the states that you
Right.
are, we're still seeing significant issues with trying to hire people. You guys always do a really good job of delineating where the particular parts of the state are particularly problematic, the content areas that are an issue. We're still seeing, some administrative positions are somewhat still challenging to fill, all of that. But I'm curious, like within those numbers, is there anything in particular that we really should be paying particular attention to with regards to specific positions or certain locales? What's your sense of that?
Yeah. So I think there are two things. I think one where you think about the particular trait, characteristic, or education of an individual would allow them to work across multiple industries, not just education. So think those with a school psychologist background, those with a social work background, nurses, for example, that have a wide variety of opportunity available to them across the economy. And then you have the industry of education competing for them as well. The fact that they can go so many different directions, you certainly see issues and challenges there. Um, Obviously, we for a long time have seen teacher shortage, particularly in the math and science
Mm.
areas, especially at the high school level when you're talking about physics, chemistry, um, calculus type teachers. Because again, for the same reason, their education allows them to potentially move into different industries, not just education. So I think you see that. I think that makes sense to most people. I think the one, and I don't think this is obviously not going to come as a surprise to you, but this is the first year in which we saw an increase in unfilled positions in administrative jobs. And
Right.
it didn't tick up a lot, but it actually moved in the other direction, which it hadn't done. And I think you and I maybe even last year talked about, you know, people have consistently talked about the fact that, well, it seems that we have enough principals, right?
Yeah.
That these principals positions are filled. And I think our conversation last year was, the fact that we don't let any planes fly without a pilot
Yeah.
doesn't mean we have enough pilots.
Right.
It just means that that plane can't fly without one.
Yeah.
Much like our schools, it's hard to operate a school effectively in the absence of a building leader. And so for this year, for us to see that there was a slight increase in those positions unfilled, that that seems to be a concern, I think, as we look forward. And you would know, I mean, that's a context I think obviously very well.
Well, we do, and obviously we look at those numbers pretty closely, and the fact that when you look since FY 2013, we've seen a 60% drop in the number of individuals that are getting that principal endorsement today versus now over a decade ago. We've had reports that talk about how the only people in a school district or in a building, rather, it's probably better to look at the building level, but in buildings that have the leadership endorsement necessary to be a principal is just the principal. We don't, while there may still be pockets of places where maybe you have a large number of people that have type 75s in buildings, we used to talk about that all the time. The number of instances in buildings where that's the case is dropping because we have, again, 50% that don't have that anymore. So those are real issues, and that's why, shameless plug for some of the work that we're doing here, but that's why we've partnered with Aurora University and got approval from ISB to introduce an alternative endorsement program for the principal endorsement. If you got a master's degree in education, you can do their internship at Aurora through them, earn some micro credentials with us. You still got to take the tests and do the teacher evaluator training, but at the end of all of that, within about a year, at a much reduced cost and time, of course, you can walk out with the endorsement. And I think, those are some kinds of things that we're going to be taking a look at. And I know, Gary, there have been studies and there have been reports out about how we have more educators sitting in seats in some cases than ever, and I think some of that was, of course, caused by the pandemic, just trying to help meet kids' needs, more administrators. and people will tout that, and that's okay. But I think, what I come back to, and you've already been alluding to this, is just the pool of available candidates is so much smaller. So we have more people, but we're pulling from a much, much smaller pool. So I would say, the educator shortage, the feeling about it is not just concerns about sheer numbers, but then are we getting our best and brightest? And that's not saying anything about those that are
Yeah.
in the job now. We know we have some super talented people in there, but are we attracting the high number of highly talented people that maybe we've been used to doing in the past?
Yeah, and I think to that point, Jason, and again, we may have talked about this a little bit last year, but I think the other thing, so kind of just objective realities, right? That when we look at education as an industry, realizing that we're in competition with a lot of other industries for really bright and talented people. If you think about your best teachers, they're self-starters, they're good communicators, they self-reflect well, they build
Yep. Work
relationships
well with
quickly,
other people.
they
Work
work well
right.
with other people.
Yeah.
Um, that skill set is valuable across every industry
Yep.
as well. And the one thing that, we learned a lot of things through the course of the pandemic, but we know that a teacher at the front of the classroom in direct conversation with students is the best way to teach. That means that I need to be in my classroom every day for 175 days to teach effectively. But if I'm one of those highly skilled people, I can live someplace really warm and work in Illinois because of the ability to work remotely. And
Yeah.
that doesn't work for public education the same way. And so understanding the context in which we are competing for the best and brightest today, that's just different. That landscape has changed in the last 5 years considerably.
Yeah.
And so what do we have to do in our industry to be best suited to compete for those talented people, given the context of how other industries are able to compete for the same talented graduates?
So, Gary, you sat as a part of, as well as me, working through the development of Vision 2030, which is the sequel to Vision 2020, which brought us great things like the evidence-based funding formula. We now have Vision 2030, which has three big priorities, like making sure we have safe environments and making sure we have predictable funding, but of course making sure that we have quality educators, making sure we have great futuristic types of learning experiences. But most specifically on the educator piece, I recall, because that was actually the priority area that I sat in on some of the conversations, as those policy recommendations were coming forward. And one of the things that was discussed was, how do we, with what came out of the pandemic and what we know now about work experience and what you just discussed there, that was talked about during those conversations about how do we look at policy recommendations, how do we look at how to provide some unique working experience types of opportunities to our educator workforce, and providing flexibility and so on and so forth. And I guess kind of my winding, weaving way of getting to a question here for you is, with this report, did you feel like at this juncture, as school districts are still trying to navigate this real issue of the educator shortage, that they're coming up with any significant creative ways of how to maybe differentiate the working experience for people, or how they're, you talked about our retired people really leaning on them very hard to fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
I mean, just a variety of things. So I'm just kind of curious, are you seeing anything creative come out of that, or just what are some of the ways that school districts are making a go of it right now as we still work through this issue?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple things. So there are a couple positives, and then there's, I think, one cautionary tale. And so I think because of what school districts have done, they've clearly shared with the agency, they've clearly shared with their local legislators, from IPA, IASA, from our organization. We've obviously talked about trying to find alternative and efficient pathways to increasing credentials so that you can teach. And so I have a college degree, I have an interest in teaching, I can form relationships with students, I can communicate effectively, but I don't have a teaching degree. And so finding ways to make those pathways a little more seamless, a little less time consuming, and a little more affordable. There's been pretty good effort to do that, both with those that already have 4-year degrees, but also with people who have been parapros, right? That have been in a classroom working with kids for a long period of time, have developed a passion for that, and then to give them a pathway to be more effective. And there's actually some legislation that's introduced to help that process along. The other really positive thing out of the 170 teacher shortage grants that were given,
Yeah,
there
the
was
teacher
one
vacancy
story.
grants.
Yeah, there was one story from up north where a school district with intention partnered with a local university and basically created a seamless pathway so that there was all kinds of predictability that the students who enroll in your teacher education program will have a place inside of our schools for all their practical experiences. Like, we'll work with you and make that as easy for them as possible. And so what ended up happening is you had two organizations that just made a choice to behave differently. It didn't cost anybody anything necessarily, but they chose to behave differently. And what that did was it made the path for those students a lot more seamless. They had ready communication, they had ready opportunities, all those things happening. And so I think, and you and I actually talked before we got on this call, the idea that if you have these grants out there and if they created and did things, let's make sure we learn from that. And let's find a way to apply that across other school districts in the state. And then I think the one cautionary tale, there's a piece of legislation out there that at least feels to me that it works against what we talked about in Vision 2020. It certainly works against what we're talking about in Vision 2030, where they're talking about moving backwards on reciprocity with people who have outside of Illinois teaching degrees, and forcing them to jump through some hoops that are probably not necessary. And I think, and again, this is a topic you can relate well to. It just seems to me that when you have good, strong building level leaders and you have an already robust evaluation process, our principals will discern the quality and the capacity of the individual that's in front of that classroom.
Yeah.
And so if the credentialing doesn't look the same as it did 25 years ago, 30 years ago, we should still trust our building level leaders to assess capacity and lean on it. It's always been surprising to me that we can use the evaluation process for a disqualifier, but we can't use it for a qualifier. I don't know what that
Which is really probably the better way to be using it, right, Gary? To be talking about
100%.
growing our people, helping them get better, and trying to use it for something that's positive rather than just negative. Because then for the majority of people, that evaluation process becomes really nothing, right? Other than just an administrative hassle, so to speak.
Yeah.
Well, and to your point, and I sure appreciate that. Of course, we've been very supportive of reciprocity as we saw that come through the Vision 2020 process. But I feel like as a state, we're still working through some policies and trying to discern how to handle them moving forward that we stubbed our toe on years ago, what I call in the race to the top era. And not to turn this into a session of lament, but we have the real issue of, in some places, not being able to hire kindergarten teachers. And who would have ever thought that would be an issue? And why is that? It's because we made a policy choice in this state to make it to where we have a K2 certificate that you can graduate with, and then a 1.6 or 1.5. Anyway, I forget the exact bands. I remember when it came into place, but what it's doing though is rather than having just a K6, or more crossover between those early grades and those later grades, people make an economic decision when they're going through school. Which of these two, if I can only do one, if I only have the capacity to do one of these, which ones do I pick? 1 through 6, because I'm better, more employable in that way.
Right.
And while I absolutely appreciate the argument that the advocates for the early childhood endorsement they propose and they speak to, it's not that they're not well reasoned, and it's not that there's not some research to back it up. It's just with the sheer practicality of how that works in the field. And unfortunately, the only thing worse than that we can have is not to have any teacher at all versus one
Right.
specifically certified
Yeah.
in those grade levels, right? And that's pretty bad when we don't have anybody that has any training or whatever. But I do get a sense, though, that there's an appetite to have conversations related to that. Also, I think when we look at and you guys, in the regional offices do a really good job of this, is working with those that are kind of looking at a second career option and certifications related to that. I mean, all of those things are really positive and good for us as far as that goes. Uh, I'm curious though, Gary, when you look at a report like this, and now you've been closely involved with it through a couple of iterations, and fortunately, ROE's picked this up long ago and started doing it, which I'm grateful for. But is there anything that's just really surprising you when you look at these results at this point in time, and where you go, man, I can't believe we're still dealing with this or that, and maybe there's nothing surprising you at all. But I'm just kind of curious about your viewpoint on that.
Yeah, I think, so having been in the superintendent seat for 16 years, I mean, you could see it, you could sense it, you could feel it coming, right? I mean, so the fact that it's here and the fact that it exists, I guess that's not surprising. I think what is surprising to me when I look at the data is some of the things that just seem to be objective realities that we're unwilling to talk about. When we think about, in particular, the most obvious one, that when you think about the teacher's retirement system and when they
Mhm.
created tier two, to not acknowledge the degree to which that is a disincentive to stay in the profession. I mean, that just seems so obvious,
Yeah.
and it shows up throughout the survey, right? It shows up throughout the survey that under the concept of working conditions, salary and benefits, in particular teachers' retirement, in particular tier two, continues to pop up. That's something that everybody is continuing to share, and so the fact that that it just seems so obvious, and yet nobody seems to want to have an honest conversation about how to best deal with it to help solve this problem. That continues to be surprising to me. I understand the fiscal nature of it, right? I understand the problem that it creates, but not talking about it's not going to solve either side of it. It's not going
Well,
to solve the
totally.
fiscal side, nor is it going to solve the teacher shortage side.
Yeah, totally agree. Well, and also when you think about the implications related to Social Security and safe harbor and a variety of other things that
Yeah,
we need a longer podcast to get into those. But I
yeah,
agree with you. In fact, I've hypothesized during the pandemic, and we're talking about the pandemic more than I sure intended to during this discussion. But when you bring this up, it does make me wonder. There was a lot of thought or conjecture that we were going to see massive attrition during the pandemic as a result of that. And I firmly believe that one of the motivators for people, besides the fact that they wanted to do what's best for young people, number one, and number two, during a crisis, I think it's always people's nature not to change too much about their lives, that they try to
yeah,
stay anchored to what they're used to and doing. So I'm sure that kept people in their jobs to a degree. But I do believe that the tier one pension system of our more veteran staff also kept them engaged and helped them endure. And
yeah,
I would offer there's nothing wrong with that because we all have the responsibility of taking care of our family and those kinds of things. And so that's okay. So I absolutely agree with you that the tier two pension is something we're going to have to contend with. I have one of my nephews just became a teacher and he's doing an outstanding job and he loves what he's doing. His soon to be wife is going to teach as well. They're both going to probably live in the northeast part of the state, close to not far from where they're from. And in talking with my nephew, whose dad is also a teacher and his grandparent and I mean his uncle, I mean all
right,
these educators, he's still looking at this going, I just don't know that I can hang with it until I'm 67 years old. And that is a
right.
fair thing to be saying and to wonder like, is this going to take care of me and my family, for the rest of my life? I don't know. But those are some real issues that we're going to have to deal with. And I appreciate you bringing it up.
Yeah, and I think, I just kind of go to the objective reality. If I'm seeking a profession in accounting, do I go into a private practice and I do people's taxes, or do I work for one of the big firms? It doesn't matter what industry you're going into. People are always thinking about the same decisions. Does
Yeah.
this allow me to provide for my family? What does in-career earning potential look like? What does post-career earning potential look like? So therefore, what is my lifetime earning potential? This is what everybody's talking about. And so
Mhm.
public education is no different. And so again, it goes back to what we talked about before. If I'm competing for the best and the brightest with other industries, how does my industry compete when I look at it through that lens?
Yeah.
In career earning potential, post-career earning potential, lifetime earning potential, how does it compare? So we shouldn't be surprised that particularly those entering the field today are considering that as a potential, you know, do I want to pursue a degree in education or not?
Well, when you look at Daniel Pink's book Drive, and I've talked about this often when I discuss, this whole notion of attrition, particularly in school leadership, that book talks about three primary things that keep people motivated in positions. Number one, they're adequately compensated. And it's not, and in fact, it's not as high of a number as you might think,
Right.
where people need to feel like they're adequately compensated to take care of themselves and their loved ones. So that's number one. Number two is meaningful work. Well, you can't get much more meaningful than education. And then the third one is autonomy. That's another thing that really motivates people. And I do worry too about schools just being a place where they feel overregulated, dealing with the
Yeah.
school code that's doubled in size in the last 20 years, some of those things. And I think you talk about cautionary tale. I do believe that's another one where, as policymakers, when they think about laws that are being passed and what we're expecting people to do, while well-intentioned and well-reasoned in many cases, we just still have to decide, is this going to be worth the investment of our educators' time, energy, focus, all of that, when they're really trying to focus in on teaching our young people and helping them live up to their potential and such as well. Now, Gary, pivoting here just a little bit, I want to talk about where people can go find this information on the IRSS website. It's irss.org. I think you can link right to the very first rotator you've
Yeah.
got. It's there. But you guys have done a really good job of creating a pretty nice dashboard. Would you mind just chatting about that a little bit, of what people will find when they go there?
Yeah. So I think the people at Goshen Consulting they just do an unbelievable job of putting all this information together in a way that you can consume it with as much depth as you would like. So as far as you want to dig, you have the ability to dig. And so what the dashboard does, it gives you a nice overview, but it also allows you to, within that dashboard, dig into my area, my kind of my part of the state in general, my specific county. I can dig deeper and get more granular. The other thing that it did was it also pulled together the unfilled position survey out of ISB. And so
Mhm.
now you have a state agency level of information that is there, and kind of a summary report associated with that, in cooperation with how our school superintendents or their designee responded to teacher shortage around the state as well. So that dashboard actually brings all that data together, and provides the ability to look either globally or granularly at it, depending upon what you want to get out of it.
Yeah. Well, I sure appreciate that, and it's extremely robust. It's really well done, and this survey, which now I almost look at as a service. Their ROEs are on the hook now, man. You got to do this for all time. I think it's even when we have plenty of educators, I still feel like this data could be really helpful to people.
Well, I think, and you bring that up, but we had a really interesting conversation about what the future of the survey is, because we talked to some superintendents that have shared, we feel like we're giving you the same data over and over and over again. But the piece that has shown up consistently is this concept of working conditions, and how working conditions affect both entry and sustainability within the profession.
Hmm.
And so we've had conversation recently about, do we redesign the survey to really get at that information? And so think almost like an exit survey, an employment
Yeah.
exit survey, where you get a sense and a feel for those that are walking out of the profession and what drove them out. Was it an opportunity outside? Was it something going on inside? but what caused them to leave. And so we've been really fortunate that the team we have together that talks about this wants to continue to make this better and provide answers and solutions rather than just observational data.
Yeah.
Like let's begin to understand what actually may kind of turn the tide from the people who are having to live it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, I absolutely am curious and interested and hopeful for what you guys come up with moving forward, because it's already a really powerful tool, and if you can add those other elements into this, it will be even more so. So definitely appreciate that. Appreciate you being here with me today, Gary.
Appreciate it, Jason. You have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Again, Gary Tipsword here with me, Executive Director of the Illinois Association of Regional Superintendents of Schools. My name is Jason Leahy, Executive Director here at IPA. Anytime the association can do something for you, don't hesitate to give us a call or check us out on the web at ilprinciples.org. Take care.